See that lighthouse behind me? In about 20 minutes, the moon is going to rise directly behind it. A full moon during the blue hour. It happens just about once a month, and it's breathtaking. So how do I know that I should be standing at this exact spot to get that photo? What camera setting should I use, and how should I post-process it? I'm going to teach you all of that, but let's start with the planning part of it. The first thing I did was I used the free Photographer's Ephemeris web app. The app gives me a rough idea of where and when I need to be standing to line up the moonrise and the lighthouse. That blue line points to the moonrise, so I just need to move the marker to a point where the blue line goes over the lighthouse on the map. Photo Ephemeris also shows you the moonrise and moonset times. I think everybody kind of knows that the sun and moon rise in the east and set in the west, but they actually move around a lot on the horizon, especially if you're far away from the equator. So the farther north or south you are, the more they move. On the left, the blue line shows you where the moon rises in December. On the right, you can see where it rises in June. The moonrise moves so much that there are shots you might only be able to line up once or twice a year. So today happens to be a really unique opportunity because I can stand here on land instead of out in the middle of the ocean somewhere or on private property, and get that shot I'm looking for. My shot's not going to be the moment moonrise occurs. It's going to be a little bit later after it's moved up in the skies. I used the free Planet smartphone app in augmented reality mode to see exactly where the moon was going to rise. This blue line shows you the exact path it's going to take and when it's going to be. 21 there is 9 o'clock. From this, I can see it's actually going to be a little high in the sky. Okay, so that tells me I'm going to have to move a little bit south to line things up perfectly. But in the meantime, let's talk about the camera gear I chose. You want to use the biggest telephoto lens you have. 200, 300 millimeters, this moon is going to be pretty small, but if you have a wider subject that you want to capture, that can work. I'm also a wildlife photographer, so I have a 600 millimeter lens with a 1.4 teleconverter, putting me at 840 millimeters. If you don't have fancy gear like this, don't sweat it, just bring what you have because it's more about the experience. In fact, this is something you can't do with a smartphone. They just don't have a telephoto lens that's big enough to really capture the moon. That's kind of good news because that's going to separate you from every Instagrammer who's using a smartphone. The investment you made in your camera gear and the time you spent educating yourself will really pay off. And if you want detailed information about camera gear like this and all the camera settings I'm going to talk about, check out Stunning Digital Photography, the #1 photography book in the world with 20 hours of video. Okay, I wrote it, so maybe I'm a little bit biased, but it's helped a lot of people. We have a coupon that you can use right now displayed on the screen. Now let's talk about the camera settings that I'm going to use. Most important is that I'm going to be shooting RAW. RAW photos, as opposed to JPEG photos, capture more dynamic range, and that's really, really important because the moon, it's lit by the sun. It's literally sunlight, and it's super, super bright compared to all the environment around me, which is at night. Thus, capturing RAW photos will show more detail in the bright moon and dark foreground than the default JPEG format. JPEG photos capture around 8 to 11 stops of dynamic range, but RAW photos capture about 15. Capturing the scene as my eyes see it is still going to be a challenge though, because the human eyes and brain perceive about 30 stops. Next, I'm going to use a continuous shutter. I'm going to take as many shots as possible because a lot of them are going to end up blurry. Telephoto lenses like this are kind of hard to use. Variations in the atmospheric conditions will ruin some shots and make some shots better too. Literally just the air moving around, especially over the water like this at this distance, that's going to be one of the biggest factors in the overall sharpness of my image, and I can't time that. I just have to take a bunch of shots. But capturing a bunch of shots will also give me the option in post-processing to stack them and virtually eliminate noise. And there's going to be noise because I'm probably going to have to use a high ISO. So let's talk about those camera settings. This is one of the few times when I'm going to have to use manual mode. The reason is the camera's auto exposure system will probably overexpose the moon, and you cannot recover overexposed highlights even from RAW files. So I will put it into manual mode and select a moderately quick shutter speed of maybe 1/160th of a second. 1/160th might seem really fast for night photography, but the moon is very, very bright. It's also moving shockingly quickly, especially through a big telephoto lens like this, and if I shoot much slower, I will literally see motion blur from the moon moving. So to preserve that sharpness, I need to keep a quick shutter speed. My aperture can probably be wide open, or maybe I'll stop it down a little bit to help bring the moon a little bit more into focus, because I ultimately have to focus on the foreground and let the moon fall a little bit out of focus. The moon's never going to be crystal clear anyway, because I'm shooting through so much atmosphere. For the ISO, I will start out at ISO 1600, and then I will double check my exposure with some test shots. I don't mind underexposing the photo a little bit, but I do not want to overexpose the photo. If I underexpose it, I can bring that up in post. If I overexpose it, the clipped highlights of the bright moon are going to be lost forever and my photo is going to be ruined. So I'll always be erring on the side of darker pictures. Some of you are wondering where my tripod is. After all, a big lens like this kind of needs it, and it's standard in night photography, but I'm going to have to shoot handheld because even when I get close to my exact location, I'm going to have to be moving like up and down this street here to line everything up perfectly. In the past, I've literally found myself sprinting to try to catch up with the moon as I'm trying to align the foreground and background subject. So use the support if you want, but I know for my purposes, I'm going to have to stay mobile. Okay, I see moonrise is just a couple of minutes away, so I'm going to move a little bit down shore and get these things lined up perfectly. My calculations were a little off, and I ended up having to literally run again with my big old camera. And then the place I needed to shoot from was behind a fence, and I couldn't hoist the camera and focus accurately enough, so I needed to trespass. But there were some construction workers who happened to be working late, and I asked them if I could go down to the beach through their property, and they said yes. So I ran down there and got as close to the shore as I could. And did I get the shot? I don't actually know, because it's so frantic and it's so difficult to focus accurately because my autofocus system completely failed. It was just too dark and the backlighting from the moon was too much. So I had to manually focus, and I'm never 100% sure. Let's go back to the computer, process these, and see how it turned out. The first thing you want to do is import your raw photos and set Lightroom to render one-to-one previews. This sequence of photos started with the moon too far to the left, but I knew ahead of time that it would be moving towards the right, so I held my position and kept shooting, and you can see the moon moving between frames until it lined up perfectly behind the lighthouse without me moving. Looking through all my photos, I think this is the set of photos that look the best. Opening the first photo in the develop module, you can see the moon here is exposed pretty well. Looking at the histogram, it's almost at the right edge of the histogram, not quite overexposed. However, that means that the lighthouse here is 7 or 8 stops underexposed to the point where you can barely see it. I could very easily raise the exposure here, and now you can see the camera captured that data for the lighthouse in its raw file, but now the moon is overexposed. I'll show you how to take care of both of those problems really easily. To handle that crazy dynamic range and bring it in, I have custom profiles that I sell on my website in what's called Tony's Technical Presets. You can see in the dynamic range set here that these profiles recover the highlights and raise the shadows far beyond what you could do without a special profile. So I'll select that profile, and now I'll be able to adjust the exposure of the photo additionally. As I'm making these adjustments, I'm looking at the histogram here. I want to be careful to not overexpose the highlights, but to recover the shadows as much as possible, especially here where the shadow detail in the lighthouse is going to be the most important part of the picture. That's important because during this step, I'm working with the raw file. But to do the stacking that I have to do in the next step, I'm going to have to export the files into a different format where those deep shadows and bright highlights are going to be lost. Therefore, I don't need to make the picture look good at this point. I just need to adjust the highlights and shadows and overall dynamic range so that everything will be captured in the exported photo. Now that I've applied the settings to one particular photo, I'm going to copy those settings by pressing Command-Shift-C or Control-Shift-C, and then I'm going to select the entire set of photos and press Control-Shift-V or Command-Shift-V. And now you can see Lightroom applied those same settings to all of the photos. Man, each of these photos is really noisy. That's what you get at ISO 25,600, but I didn't have any choice. I just could not have shot at 850 millimeters any slower than 1/160th of a second. But all these pictures did turn out sharp. There's no obvious camera shake. I seem to have hit the focus point close enough. What I'm going to do now is to select all those photos by clicking the first one and shift clicking the last one. Then I will right click it, select Edit In, and select Open as Layers in Photoshop. You can see Photoshop put all of those pictures onto layers. If I hide the layers, you'll see that they don't line up perfectly. That's because my camera moved between each shot because I was holding it over my head and hand holding it. But that's really easy to fix in Photoshop. All I need to do is to select the top layer, shift click to select the bottom layer. That selects all the layers. Now I can go to Edit and Auto Align Layers. So I'll click OK. Now the images are aligned, and if I hide these layers, you'll see that they are all nicely stacked on top of one another. So let's view all the layers and make sure that they're all still selected. The next thing I'm going to do is to go to Layer, Smart Objects, and Convert to Smart Object. Now those layers are combined into a single smart object. They appear as a single layer, but I can still act on these separate layers. I'll go to Layer, Smart Objects, and then Stack Mode, and mean. Mean is another word for average. It's going to take each point in the image, look at all those different layers, and pick the average one. This is called image stacking. And what it does is it combines multiple shorter images into one long exposure. The end result is essentially a picture taken at a longer shutter speed and a lower ISO. I'm combining 8 pictures. So essentially I multiply the 1/160th shutter speed times 8, and I divide the ISO 25,000 by 8. That is essentially a 3-stop difference. You can see it already looks much cleaner. This is all I need to do in Photoshop. I'll close out of that, save it, and bring it back into Lightroom to do the rest of the work. Zoomed way in, you can see the dramatic improvement we have here. That's because the stacked images essentially have a shutter speed of 1/20th of a second. There's no way I could have handheld a picture at 1/20th of a second under those conditions, but by combining multiple shorter pictures, I allow the image stabilization system to get each shorter interval sharp and then combine them in post. This is basically what your iPhone does when it's shooting in night mode. Now we need to do a little bit of additional processing on this picture, so I'll pull it into the Develop module. Note that I'm now working with a TIFF file, which means things like recovering shadows and highlights are impossible. That's why it was important for me to pull all of the highlights and shadows into the visible range of the photo before I brought it into Photoshop. So I'll level it, and I'm going to crop it to an 8:10 perspective for Instagram. The picture looks very washed out now. I can see from looking at the histogram that there's no black point in it. So I will lower the blacks. I can see this red blob here is the moon, which means the moon is about as bright as it can be. I can try to raise the whites, but if I do that, you can see I just start losing some of the gorgeous color. I think I want the lighthouse to be quite a bit brighter, so what I'll do is I'll raise the entire exposure of the picture and then drop the highlights down to recover some of that moon. Now, even with the highlights brought all the way down, it's still not quite enough. You can see I'm losing a bunch of detail. In my technical preset pack, I have special presets for recovering dynamic range for situations just like these. Some recover just the highlights, others recover just the shadows, but I have some that recover both the highlights and shadows, which are what I need in this situation. So I'll select that. This gives me more adjustment latitude than is possible by using the sliders alone. This file looks really noisy, but I haven't applied any noise reduction yet. It's always going to look noisy because it was really dark and the sensor just wasn't getting much light. That's why the shadows are always noisier than the highlights in a photo. I can use some sharpening to bring back some of the detail. Now I'm going to do some dodging to raise the shadows on the lighthouse even further so we can see it against that incredibly bright moon. I'm going to set my flow really low so that I can make multiple passes to really fine-tune the adjustment. That just makes the adjustments a little bit smoother. And a good sign you've overdone the adjustments is when you start to see some edge glow from the subjects. It's certainly something I've been guilty of. It's easy in the brush to undo that by holding down the Alt or Opt key and then stroking over it. Okay, up until now, all the adjustments I've done have been to recreate what I saw with my own eye. There's nothing really artificial here. This is a true picture. I could spend days editing a photo like this, but hopefully I've taught you the basic concepts you need to Find a moonrise and line it up with an interesting foreground subject. Choose your camera settings and gear to get the best possible shot, and then post-process it to handle that very extreme dynamic range that you will necessarily encounter. If you want to learn more like this, check out my book, Stunning Digital Photography, which has more than 20 hours of video in it. It's a book, or you can just watch the videos, or the best results will be if you do both. The ebook is literally only $9.99, so it's incredibly inexpensive. We also have books on Lightroom and Photoshop. Both of those include a massive amount of video training, and they're also really inexpensive. And the best deal is to buy the group of books together. This particular example shows how landscape photographers need technique, Lightroom, and Photoshop to produce the very best results. If you have any follow-up questions, add a comment down below. Of course, subscribe to get more free videos. You know, we used to make more tutorials, but nowadays tutorials don't get that big of a response from our audience. People seem to be more interested in gear stuff, so we try to give you what you want. But if you do want to see more tutorials, like, make it worth my while. Click subscribe, tell your friends about it, send them here. The more views we get, I promise, the more tutorials you'll see in the future. Thanks so much. I'm Tony Northrup. Bye.